Welcome to the Godly Playroom. It's so good to have you back with us again. It seems like such a long time for us getting ready. As you can see, we have almost finished with the time of the color purple, and we are about to enter into the mystery that is Easter. This week we move into Holy Week, the time where we tell some of those stories of the last week of Jesus' life. So as that clock has moved around and we are almost entering into that season of Easter, today's story is a story about Holy Week. But let's take a moment to get ourselves settled and ready. My name is Ruth Womack. And it's my privilege to be in this room to share some of the stories that have provided hope and comfort and challenge to the people of God for generations. Whether this is your first time in the Godly Playroom or one of many times, we hope you come close to God in our time together. You might like to get a candle so that you can light a candle as a reminder of the Holy Presence. You might like to find some materials for your art response. You might like to find something to have for snack. Or you might like to just curl up with a cup of your favorite beverage, your favorite blanket, and something cuddly, and just settle into this time together. We remember that once there was someone who said such amazing things and did such wonderful things, the people began to follow him. And the more they followed him, the more they wondered who he was. So one time they just had to ask, "Who are you?" And one time when they asked him that question, he said, "I'm the light." See how the light grows whenever it's shared. I'm going to put the candle back on the shelf so we have room to tell this story. It is a huge story. I have troubles carrying it by myself. So if you're ever in the Godly Playroom and want to work with this story, make sure to ask for help. It is a Godly Play story, and it is copyright protected and used with permission. So, I wonder what you need to be ready today. You'll know what you need. Sometimes it helps to sit and have our bodies be a little bit still, to turn off some of that background noise if we can, and just be present. Sometimes our breathing helps us settle into that presence. So to take a deep breath in through the nose and out through the mouth. You might choose to do a few more of those deep breaths. Even a smile helps to soften our facial muscles. And I'm going to move the camera a little bit closer so you get a better view of this huge story. This is a map of the city of Jerusalem during Jesus' time. It was already a very old city by then. Nobody knows for sure when it was built, but it's over 3,000 years old now. And it's still a place of pilgrimage for Jews and Christians and Muslims. About 1,000 years before Jesus was born, King David took the city from the Jebusite people and made it his own. His son, King Solomon, built the first temple there. That temple was burnt by the Babylonians. They took many of the people of Jerusalem into exile. When the people began to come back, they rebuilt the temple, and it was rebuilt and expanded again around the time that Jesus was born. Here are the city walls. Here is the Temple Mount. Here's the upper room, or at least as much as anyone can remember where it belongs after so many centuries. And here is the fortress of Antonia. The palace of the high priest Caiaphas. And the palace of King Herod. The Kidron Valley runs along the east side of the city. Some say that at one time there was a bridge from the city to the Mount of Olives, but others are not so sure. But the Mount of Olives was where the Garden of Gethsemane was and still is today. And here is Golgotha, the place of the skull, where Jesus died on a cross. Once each year, the people of God come to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover, to remember how God brought them through the waters into freedom. Jesus has come to Jerusalem many times, as a child, as an adult with his family and friends. One time, the Mother Mary and the Father Joseph lost Jesus, the boy, in Jerusalem, and then they found him in the temple. This story is about the last time Jesus came to Jerusalem. And we tell it each year in this Holy Week season. Jesus and his friends would have come south along that Kidron Valley, following the winding, twisting Jordan River till they arrived at Jericho. There he healed blind Bartimaeus, and they had supper with Zacchaeus. After they left Jericho, they crossed the southern low desert and began the steep climb into the city. Perhaps they stopped at Bethany for their Sabbath rest. Jesus sent a few of his disciples on into the city to borrow a donkey. And on Monday morning, he rode that donkey into the city, probably through one of the southern gates, following the old pilgrim's route through the older part of the city to the Temple Mount. Some people noticed and wondered if he was the Messiah. They began to cut palm branches from the trees, and they threw their cloaks on the road in front of him. Some even shouted, "Hosanna! Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord." Jesus and his friends would have climbed that limestone slab street of steps that leads to the Temple Mount. They probably left the donkey there if they went into the temple to pray. They might have come in through the double gate, or perhaps up the outside stairs into a wide open area, and then crossed it to enter the temple to pray. When they were finished, they went back out of the city, across the Kidron, and up to the Mount of Olives to spend the night. On Monday, Jesus came back into the city with his friends through that southern gate and went to the temple, where he began to teach. He probably sat with the other rabbis in that southwest corner of the great courtyard called the Court of Gentiles. And when they were finished for the day, they went back out of the city, across the Kidron, to the Mount of Olives to sleep. On Tuesday, they came into the city again. And perhaps this time they came up the inside stairs into that long, narrow portico where the Sanhedrin meets at one end. The merchants and the money changers were there. And Jesus got very angry when he noticed all that buying and selling going on in such a holy place. He turned over the tables of the money changers, and he upset the cages with the birds and the little animals used for sacrifice. He called on the people to keep the temple as a place of prayer. The temple guard began to watch him more carefully. They noticed how the crowds gathering around him were growing. That night, Jesus and his friends left the city to cross the Kidron, perhaps past the Mount of Olives to Bethany to spend the night. People watched them go and began to whisper about the legend of how the Messiah was to come down to the Mount of Olives and bring an army of angels to drive away the Roman soldiers. On Wednesday, the crowds grew even larger, and the temple guard were worried. They began to look for a way to arrest Jesus. When Jesus went back out of the city and across the Kidron to the Mount of Olives, perhaps he and Peter, James, John, and Andrew sat on that hillside watching the sunset across the Temple Mount, talking and wondering about what would happen next. On Thursday, the temple guards decided to arrest Jesus, but he was nowhere to be found. He sent a few of his disciples into the city. They had asked him where he wanted to keep Passover, and he told them to watch for a man carrying a water jar who would show them. And so later that night, Jesus and his friends came through the darkened streets to the appointed house, and they crept up the stairs to the upper room, where they shared their Last Supper together. After they had eaten everything that they wanted, Jesus took the bread, and he blessed it, and he broke it, and he shared it with them. And he also took a cup of the fruit of the vine, and he poured it out for them after giving thanks, and shared it with them. And he said something like, "Whenever you share the bread and the cup like this, I'll be there." They did not understand, but they did not forget. Jesus also told them to love one another. And he showed them how to care for one another by washing their feet. After this had happened, Judas got up and left. The others sang a hymn, and then they too went back across the Kidron to the Mount of Olives. It was even later by now, and very dark. You could hardly see the lights of the city across the way. Jesus went to the Garden of Gethsemane. He wanted to pray. His disciples fell asleep. When Jesus came back to where they were, the temple guard appeared out of the shadows, and they arrested Jesus. Judas was with them and showed them the way to Jesus. They arrested him and they dragged him off into the night, and Jesus' friends fled into the shadows. They probably brought Jesus to the house of Caiaphas, the high priest. And there they asked him many questions, but Jesus said nothing. Finally, the high priest tore his robes and he shouted, "Blasphemy!" And they convicted Jesus of the crime of pretending to be God. That night, they might have taken him to a jail in the Roman fortress of Antonia. And Friday morning, they brought him before the governor, Pontius Pilate, who also asked Jesus many questions. "Are you the king of the Jews?" "You say that I am." And Jesus wouldn't say anything else. When Jesus wouldn't answer, Pilate sent him to King Herod. King Herod quickly grew bored with Jesus, though, and sent him back to the governor. Pilate brought Jesus out before the crowds. There's a tradition at Passover that the governor releases a prisoner, and so he asked them, "Should I release Barabbas or Jesus?" And they shouted, "Barabbas!" And so Pilate handed Jesus over to the soldiers to be flogged and crucified. They took him through the city and outside the walls to Golgotha, and they hung him on a cross, and he died. Some people still follow that route to be close to Jesus and to pray. They start at a school near where the fortress of Antonia used to be, and they follow the Via Dolorosa, the Street of Sadness, to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. After Jesus had died, One of his followers, Joseph of Arimathea, asked to have the body taken down, and they put it in a tomb, which is a special place for the dead. And they rolled a great stone across the opening to seal it, like a locked door. On Saturday, the earth was so quiet, you could almost hear it breathing. And on Sunday, it was the women, Mary Magdalene and some of the others, who had the courage to go to the tomb. They wanted to be close to Jesus, even though it was very sad. But when they got there, the stone had been rolled away, and the tomb was empty. Jesus had died, but somehow he was still with them, just as he is with us today. And that changes everything. I wonder what part of this story you liked best. It's such a big story. You might want to pause the video while you have conversations with the people in your household, or do some thinking about these questions. I wonder what the most important part of this story is. I always find it fascinating that as people today, we still tend to build great big buildings and places of worship and huge things, and we think that bigger is better. And yet for me, perhaps the most important part of this story is something that is empty. Or perhaps the power that rolled away that stone. I wonder if there's any part of this story we could leave out and still have all the story that we need. Always feels to me like a lot of back and forth. They go into the city and out to the Mount of Olives, and into the city and out to the Mount of Olives. Then he went to Caiaphas and the governor and to Herod and back and forth. And sometimes I get impatient. Maybe that's what I would leave out, is my impatience. Because it takes time for such a big story to unfold. It takes time for us to get ready to enter into such a great mystery that is Easter. Just as it will take time for us to celebrate the season of Easter, because we can't hold it in to an empty tomb or one Sunday. It just keeps on going all the way to Pentecost. But that part of the story is a long way off for Jesus' followers in this week. So I wonder where you are in this story, or what part of this story might be especially for you today. I'd like to be in the garden. Maybe praying with Jesus. Maybe sitting on the hillside watching the sunset or the sunrise. Talking with friends. I wonder what else your community of faith might be doing as part of Holy Week. Sometimes there are extra services. Monday, Thursday is that service where we remember Jesus' commandment to love one another, and we wash each other's feet as a reminder of the service to which Jesus calls us. Good Friday services are those times when we hear again the story of the trials and the crucifixion. And we wait with the women at a distance, grieving and weeping over the violence and the death and the sadness that is still so much a part of our world. It's an odd name to call it Good Friday. It's a bit of a language shift down through the centuries from God's Friday to Good Friday. And then sometimes some churches have what's called an Easter Vigil. And that takes many different shapes and forms. It happens sometime on the Saturday, and sometimes people will fast. They stop eating. They might only have water, or they might not even have water during that time. And they remember that space when everything was so quiet. You could almost hear the earth breathing. It is a reminder for all of us that when horrible, horrible things happen, we need time and space to sit, to lament and keep vigil, watch with one another. And then everything changes. And sometimes that happens early Easter morning with outdoor services, and sometimes it happens with a breakfast or a brunch together, and then with the sound of trumpets and the story of the women coming to the tomb, wondering how on earth will they roll away the stone to discover God has already been there. And not even death itself can contain the love of God. I wonder how you will remember this story, or what you might do to mark Holy Week. If you're a reader, you might like to read over the story in the Bible. You might like to recreate parts of this story and tell it yourself. You might like to listen to some music. There is a lot of beautiful and sad music that has been written about Jesus last week. Some of those beautiful images that are so heart-wrenching of the Mother Mary holding her son's body before they lay him in the tomb. A lot of people would like to just leave out Good Friday, to leave out all of this sadness and hurt. But they go together. That is the mystery of Easter. Now, whenever we remember the empty tomb, we also know the sadness of the crucifixion is there. And when we remember that shadowed and awful time of Good Friday, we know that Easter is there as well. And we can't pull them apart. However this week unfolds for you, wherever you find yourself in this story, I hope you trust that God is already there and will find a way to roll the stone away and invite you back into life in all its abundance. I'll invite you to use this coming week as your response to this story. To share a feast at some point with those you love, whether that's on Zoom or Facebook chat or Duo or however that happens. And for now, we'll change the light. And remember the presence that is always with us. So watch what happens when I change the light. As we enter into the season of Easter, where everything changes. God bless. Be well. Look after one another until we meet again.